This is lecture number 10 for Friday, May 8th for the History of the French Revolution at Northland College. Last time I talked about the first year of the Revolution, essentially from 1789 until 1790. And I want to talk this time about a bunch of that first, the Fête de la Fédération, the Festival of Federation, in the summer of 1790 was sort of a self-congratulatory. Hey, we did it. We're done with the revolution. We just have to finish off that Constitution, and then we'll be all set. And we've done all the reforms we want to do. We've gotten rid of the noble privileges. We've nationalized the church. We have issued the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen. And so a lot of people in the National Assembly and in the nation as a whole thought that the revolution was basically over. They had done everything they set out to do. But there were a bunch of tensions and conflicts under there that were still bubbling and were really about to explode. And in a lot of ways, the Marxists would say this were class conflicts that had been sort of papered over, that nobody had realized. Other people would say that there were the conflicts had different sources. But let me talk about some of these tensions and conflicts that throughout late 1790 and then into 1791, these tensions were sort of there below the surface. The first is that different groups of revolutionaries had a different idea of what kind of society they wanted. They all used, the motto of the French Revolution was liberté, égalité, fraternité, liberty, equality, and brotherhood. And but they meant different things by that. In particular, and this is sort of a Marxist interpretation, the middle classes, the doctors, the lawyers, the merchants, etc., tended to think that liberty and equality meant that you had laws that applied equally to everybody, and that you had rights, that people were free. There was a right to free speech, and there was, etc. You had certain rights: a right to a fair trial, a right to not be imprisoned without being charged with a crime, etc. And they felt that once you had those individual rights written into the Constitution or the laws, and the laws applied equally to everyone, that's what they meant by equality and liberty. And so the middle classes, they tended to like, and this today we recognize as the ideology of liberalism, but they tended to assume that that once you give people equal rights and equal status before the law, you've done all you can to make people equal. And after that, it's about individual talent and effort, etc. And so the people in the National Assembly, the sort of middle classes in the National Assembly, tended to say, well, it's okay that some people are rich and some people are poor, because some people have more talent or work harder, etc., and other people work less hard. And so as long as everyone has the same opportunities in terms of having equal laws and equal status before the law, as long as that's been made equal, then all the resulting inequalities are okay, right? And so the people in the middle classes, the Marxists would say the bourgeoisie, tended to think that all you had to do was ensure equal rights. There's no privileges for nobles, there's no privileges for the church. The law applies equally to everybody. And nobody has special privileges. Once you've done that, you've got equality. And then you guarantee some rights like free speech and freedom from being arrested, and then you have liberty, right? But, and if you wanted to sort of define liberty there, it means liberty to do whatever you want as long as you're not harming anybody else or taking away somebody else's liberty. So obviously you can't murder somebody else because you're harming somebody else and taking away their liberty to do what they want. But short of that, you're pretty much free to do whatever you want to. If they were to define liberty, it's free. It's liberty to do as long as you're not hurting somebody else. However, there was another sense of this running around, and this owed a lot to Rousseau. Although a lot of the people who embraced this hadn't read Rousseau, but especially amongst the lower classes in Paris, there was another sense. They didn't think in terms of individuals and individual liberty. They tended to think more in terms of communities. And in particular, they tended to say, we need everybody, the whole community should be involved in governing. right? And they tended to think of the laws as applying to the whole community. And so they tended to say, well, it's not about what's good for each individual or giving each individual equal opportunity. It's about ensuring that the community thrives and flourishes as a whole. And in particular, this includes a number of freedoms or liberties that were freedom from starvation, freedom from fear, freedom, and so there was a sense in which you had to not just give people equal laws and equal rights, you had to actually go farther and ensure that people had enough food, and ensure that people were involved in the process, and ensure that people were taken care of. Because that was where real freedom came from, according to the lower class in Paris. This is the roots of what today would be called socialism. This idea that you don't just give people equal opportunities and equal laws and say, go do what you do and whatever happens, happens. Instead, you say, no, we're going to make sure that you're never too poor, you always have enough to eat, you always have food, you always have shelter, you always have, etc. So it's a freedom from want, it's a freedom from fear, it's a freedom from starvation, as much as it's a freedom to do whatever you want, right? So these two visions, the sort of the freedom to do whatever you want, which the middle class has embraced, and the freedom from want, starvation, fear, etc., that the lower class has embraced, those were different visions of what the government should be doing. And the reforms of 1790, etc., had really satisfied the first set. They had gotten equality before the laws, they had ensured that everyone was free to do certain things, free speech, etc., but they had not addressed the issue of bread prices in Paris. They had not addressed the issue of education for everybody or housing for everybody. They hadn't even come close to addressing those things. And so the working classes of Paris were still upset because they hadn't gotten what they thought they were going to get out of the revolution. Right? A second tension, what came out of the expectations of the French Revolution, saw the birth of something we would call nationalism, right? The idea that the nation was an integral community, and that the nation was a sort of a unit for thinking with. You should think about Frenchmen, and this was not something before. I mean, when the French Revolution happened, the vast majority of the population of France didn't speak French as the way we understand it. There were regional dialects of all sorts of French all over the place, and they often were different enough that people from the north of France couldn't understand people from the south of France, and people from the south of France couldn't understand people from Brittany. And people in Brittany, in fact, spoke Bretagne, which is a relative Gaelic and Irish. It's not actually related to French. And there were, in different regions, there were people who spoke Italian and people who spoke German, and different dialects of French, and people who spoke Spanish. There wasn't what we would call a sort of a unified national community. But during the French Revolution, they began to talk as if there was a unified national community. And so they began to say, well, we need to sort of figure out what it means to be French, and then everybody's got to be French, because we're all in this together. But one of the key sticking points was the status of Catholicism. Because most of the people in France were Catholic, but there were a lot of people in France who were either Protestant or Jewish, or were sort of deists or atheists coming out of the Enlightenment. And so for those people, Catholicism was not an integral part of what it meant to be French. But for a lot of people it was. And so nationalism sort of set aside Catholicism and said that's not really what it means to be French. So nationalists talked about France as this glorious nation and culture, etc., but they didn't really emphasize that it was Catholic. But for a lot of people, they were not on board with the idea of defining France without Catholicism. Catholicism was who they were. And so, and the National Assembly did a number of things that really exacerbated that distinction between being loyal to the nation and being loyal to the Catholicism. Because I mentioned they nationalized the church with a series of laws over the late 1789, early 1790. The last thing they did in 1790 was that they put in place something called the Civil Constitution of the Clergy. Now I mentioned that when they nationalized the church, they had seized all the church's land and buildings, etc., and wealth, and then they had said, now all the members of the church are employees of the government. The Civil Constitution of the Clergy was a formal document stating the relationship between the clergy and the French government, but it basically said everybody who wanted to be a priest or some member of the clergy in the French church had to swear an oath of allegiance to the French government and the French Constitution. And this explicitly said that that loyalty to the nation was higher than their loyalty to the Pope. All right? And so, and in particular, they said if a priest does not take the oath, then that priest will not be employed as a priest by the French government. So every priest in France had to make this decision. Were they going to remain true to their Catholicism and say that the Pope was their chief loyalty, but then they can't be priests anymore? They would be thrown out of the church. Or do they take an oath of loyalty to the government, but then they're not being good Catholics? And in fact, the Pope issued a proclamation saying that anybody who took the oath of loyalty to the French government was going to be excommunicated from the Catholic Church. So basically what the civil constitution of the clergy did was it forced all the clergy to make a decision: am I Catholic or am I French? Right? And it even applied to their followers, because for an ordinary Catholic, if you're going to get married, are you going to go to the priest who is the employee of the French government, but who has been excommunicated by the Pope? Is that marriage valid if you're Catholic? Or are you going to go to the priest who is loyal to the Pope, but is not legally allowed to marry you in France? Right? So every single person had to sort of make a decision about how they were going to practice their Catholicism, because every priest had to be either for the French government or for the Catholic Church. Right? And so lots of peasants in particular, Catholicism was so built into their lives that they really, the civil constitution of the clergy turned them against the revolution. We'll see this later with the Vendée revolt and the Chouans. But basically, this is a tension that's right there in the center of the French Revolution. Is this French Revolution is trying to get everybody to build this new identity around this nation of France instead of around the king and Catholicism. But that puts a lot of people in awkward positions where they have to choose between their Catholicism and the French Revolution. The last thing is they're trying to create a constitutional monarchy in 1790-91, and they have a king who does not agree with the central premise of a constitutional monarchy, which is that the king's powers are limited by the Constitution and that the king gets his authority from the people through the Constitution. King Louis XVI did not agree with that. He played along with the game as long as he felt he had to, but he really didn't think, in the end, he thought his power came from God, and that God had chosen him to have this position, and he did not owe it to the Constitution or to the people of France, and so they had no right whatsoever to limit his authority. And yet, the National Assembly was trying to write a constitution built around the king as the centerpiece of all authority in the French Constitution. Well, all these tensions are there, and they will all come to the point of violence at some point in the next year or two. But the first one was, of course, the king's lack of allegiance to the new constitution, because by October of 1790, Louis XVI had decided that his only option was to somehow get out of France. Now, you remember that he, of course, was trapped in the Tuileries Palace in Paris, because after the October days in 1789, he had been sort of locked up, and he was really sort of watched all the time. He couldn't get out. He had actually, in June of 1791, he decided to try a sort of trial run. How far away from the Tuileries could I get without people stopping me? He decided on Easter of 1791 he was going to go to Saint-Cloud, which is a suburb of Paris on the western edge of Paris, to a church there to listen to Mass. But when he got in the carriage and started to leave the Tuileries, crowds surrounded him. They wouldn't let the horses go, and they wouldn't let the carriage go, and he had to go back to the Tuileries. So he realized he's really trapped there. He's locked. Well, he started to talk to various people about making plans, and obviously this is the subject of the whole Tackett book, so I'm not going to go into too much detail. But Mirabeau, who was this deputy in the National Assembly, who was a wealthy aristocrat, proposed to the king that he should try to sneak out through Rouen and go up into England. But Marie Antoinette's friend, Axel von Fersen, and Tackett talks about him, he probably was the queen's lover, we don't know. He suggested that they have this plan to run across northern France to Belgium, where they would be met by Austrian troops, because Belgium was an Austrian territory at that time, it was under the control of Austria. And so they decide to try it, and on June 20th, 1791, the king and his family, and Tacket gives you the whole story, so I'm not going to go into the details. They try to go to Varennes, they get caught, right? And this was a real problem, as Tacket points out, for the National Assembly, because by June 20th of 1791, the Constitution was pretty much finished. They had been working on it for 2 years, since May of 1789, and they finally had a constitution. And they had intricate negotiations with Louis about what he would accept and what he wouldn't accept. And he takes off for Varennes, and he leaves behind this letter saying he rejects the whole idea of the revolution. And so clearly, Louis is not on board with the Constitution of 1791. And yet, it's taken him 2 years to write this thing, and it's all built around Louis, right? Take him out of there, the whole thing falls apart, right? And so the National Assembly now has to make a decision. What do we do with this? Well, there were some people who said, well, oust Louis, depose him, and put his son in his place. His son's young, he's like 10 at the time. We'll make him a puppet. And they're like, no, we actually need a king at the center of the Constitution. We need somebody who can actually run things. So we can't just have a 10-year-old boy at the beginning. Other people said, no, some people began to immediately demand that they get rid of Louis and they make a republic. They get rid of the monarchy altogether. On July 17th, there was a massive demonstration at the Champ de Mars, which is the big field just outside of today the Eiffel Tower is sitting in it. And this big demonstration, thousands of people showed up, and they were all signing a petition demanding that the National Assembly depose Louis XVI and abolish the monarchy. Well, a lot of people in the National Assembly did not want this. They were really very loyal to the monarchy, at least the idea of monarchy, even if Louis XVI was kind of problematic as a king. And so Lafayette and the National Guard go to the Champ de Mars, and they open fire on the protesters, and they kill about 50 people, right? And so the so-called Massacre du Champ de Mars really drives this wedge between those people who want a republic and those people who want a monarchy, right? They're literally on opposite sides of the gun at this point. Well, the National Assembly itself is split. There's a faction which would come to be called the Feuillants, led by Lafayette and some other moderates who want the monarchy. They're loyal to the monarchy, the idea of a monarchy, or at the very least they want a really moderate republic that doesn't give the common people a whole lot of voice. But then there was this other group. I talked about the clubs last time. The Jacobins were this club that was right across the street from the National Assembly, and a lot of members of the National Assembly were in the Jacobin Club, and they were really getting pretty radical. They were starting to call for the monarchy, for a republic rather, right? In addition, the other club, the Cordelier Club that I mentioned, they didn't have the representation in the National Assembly that the Jacobin Club did, but there were members of the Cordelier Club who were really involved in demanding a republic right now. In particular, a guy named Danton, Georges Danton, was a brilliant orator, was a brilliant sort of rabble-rouser, and he was in the Cordelier Club, and he was one of the organizers of the demonstration at the Champ de Mars to sign the petition, and Danton is really pushing hard for a republic by this point. And so there's a lot of agitation amongst the people of Paris in particular to want to get rid of the king and get a republic, right? Well, the National Assembly essentially makes their decision. What they were going to do is they were going to implement, they came up, their solution was this. They said, Louis did not want to leave for Varennes. He wasn't doing it voluntarily. He was kidnapped by aristocrats, and they were taking him away, and we saved him. And so officially they said Louis did not reject the Constitution. Louis loves the Constitution. Louis loves the revolution. The letter that Louis had left behind where he denounces the revolution, they just kept that under wraps. Never happened. Nobody saw it, right? And so they basically just said, everything's great. Louis is our guy. And they said to Louis, you're going to play along with this, otherwise we'll throw you in prison. So they go ahead with the new Constitution, the Constitution of 1791. And they say we're going to enact it. And so on September 14th, 1791, the National Assembly dissolves itself. Right? It's been there for 2 years since May of or June of 1789. They've been there for 2 years. They dissolve themselves, and they say we're done. Now remember, that National Assembly was really the Estates General. Right? It had a quarter of the group was clergy, a quarter was aristocrats, and then half of it was commoners. And it was like 1,200 people. Right? So the National Assembly dissolves itself. And they say we're going to hold new elections for a new legislative assembly, a regular Congress, so to speak, for the French government under the new Constitution. Now, there's a couple of points about this. Number one, they made the rule that nobody from the National Assembly could stand for election to the next legislative assembly. They didn't want anybody consolidating power here, so it was going to be a completely new group of people in the new legislative assembly. Second, under this Constitution of 1791, there were voting restrictions. In particular, to vote, you had to. There were like several levels. If you paid a certain amount of taxes, basically 3 days of workman's wages and taxes, which meant that if you were middle class, you could vote. But what you did is you voted in your district for somebody who would be basically what we would call a delegate in the Electoral College, who would go on, and the delegates had to pay more in taxes, and those delegates would vote on the people who would actually take office. But to take office, you had to pay that higher amount of taxes, and certain high offices required even more taxes paid before you were eligible. So basically what they were saying is only people of a certain level of wealth can vote. The working classes can't vote. Peasants can't vote. Only the middle classes and up can vote. And then those people, to actually get elected to office, you had to be worth more money. And to be elected to high office, you had to be worth more money. And so the Constitution had clearly favored the middle class. And the Marxists, of course, point to this and they say, this is obvious that the middle class is trying to consolidate their power and exclude the working class from political power by saying only rich people can vote. Right? But one of the things that they did then is that this new legislative assembly that's elected in September, I don't know, it's actually early October of 1791, is very different than the previous National Assembly. Right? The National Assembly had all those clergymen, it had all the aristocrats, it had all these commoners. The clergy are pretty much gone. There are very few clergy who get elected to the Legislative Assembly. And the aristocrats are much less in number. There's far fewer aristocrats. And so the vast majority of the new Legislative Assembly is middle class, and it's in particular lawyers. It's overwhelmingly lawyers. Right? There are some rich merchants and things like that. But there's actually a couple of interesting things. Well, actually, I'll get into that in a little bit. So this new Legislative Assembly gets elected in 1791, and they know that the king actually hates the Constitution and hates the whole French Revolution, but they're committed to it, right? And this new national or legislative assembly is split. It's got factions. It's starting to get what we would call political parties are showing. And as I mentioned, the Feuillants were led by Lafayette and a couple of other wealthy people, and the Feuillants were loyal to the idea of monarchy, and they were moderates. They were like, we've done enough. We have changed enough. The revolution is over. We've done everything we should do. But the Jacobins tended to say, the people who were elected as Jacobins were like, we don't like this monarchy. We don't like the Constitution of 1791. We actually want a republic. And we think there's a whole lot more we could do to make more radical changes we could do to French society, more changes that are necessary. And so, and roughly the Feuillants were about 260 members of this new legislative assembly. The Jacobins are about 136 members, right? So about half as many. And then there's about a 300 undecided representatives in the Legislative Assembly who don't fall into either of those categories. So what gets set up in this Legislative Assembly is a sort of a showdown between the 130-some Jacobins over here, the 260-some Feuillants over there, and this group in the middle who's undecided, and they have to be, the two sides, the Jacobins and the Feuillants, are going to try to convince them to go along with their positions. All right. Now, a new thing enters the... So that's October of 1791, and going into November, the new Legislative Assembly steps up, and they're the new government of France. Okay, but almost immediately, the question of war enters the picture. And the reasons for this were several. The first is that the Emperor of Austria is the brother of Marie Antoinette, who's the wife of Louis XVI of France. So the Emperor of Austria is the brother-in-law of Louis XVI of France. Now, there's actually two brothers involved. The first Emperor of Austria, Leopold II, was the emperor when the French Revolution started. He actually dies in March of 1792, and he's succeeded by his younger brother as Emperor Francis II. But they're both brothers of Marie Antoinette. Right? So I'm going to sort of paper over that and just call him the Austrian Emperor. But the Austrian emperors had decided after the flight to Varennes, their plan at Varennes had been that Louis would get across the border into Austrian territory. The Austrians would meet him there. They'd put together a big army of French people who were loyal to the king and Austrians. And they would invade France and they would crush the French Revolution. Well, obviously the king getting caught at Varennes stopped that. And so from that point onward, from June of 1791 onward, the Austrians were trying to figure out how they could help Louis now that he was trapped in France. And basically the Austrians, especially the new emperor, Francis II, in March of 1792, he is really in favor of just going to war, invading France, crushing the revolution, and saving Louis and his sister Marie Antoinette. Right? And so everybody knows that this is on the horizon. Right? And one of the reasons, there's a couple reasons the Austrians want to do this. One is to save, Louis and Marie Antoinette. But the second is that they're kind of worried about the French Revolution. They're worried that this idea that monarchs have to have constitutions, that there be limits on monarchs' power, those are not ideas they want circulating. And it's clear that those ideas are circulating, that everybody is watching the French Revolution, and everybody is hearing what French revolutionaries are saying. And these sort of ideas are dangerous. So the Austrians really want to crush us, as does every other monarch in Europe. The English, the Prussians, the Russians, the Austrians, the various Italian kingdoms, the Spanish, they all want to crush this because they don't like the idea. They don't like these ideas coming out of France. Well, within France, there were a number of people who also wanted war. I mean, the obvious one is Louis XVI. At this point, he's trapped in the Tuileries, and he's the head of the French government in theory, but he can't leave. It's obvious now he can't leave. And so what does he do? And his only option, in his mind, seems to be to have the Austrians and anybody else invade France and crush the revolution from the outside. So Louis is actively trying to encourage the Austrians to invade. He's committing treason. He's actually conspiring with the Austrian government to invade France and crush the French government. And Louis's goal is, of course, to roll back the revolution entirely. He just wants to totally go back to pre-1789, where he had all the power, and etc. Right? So that's Louis's goal. But other people, like the Feuillants, like Lafayette actually wants the war because Lafayette realizes that Lafayette liked the revolution. He's happy with the Constitution of 1791. He's happy with some of the changes, the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, etc. But he wants it to stop. He knows the Jacobins are demanding more radical changes, and he doesn't want that to happen. And so Lafayette says, well, maybe a war would be a good way to, in a war, the government has to sort of get all law and orderly and take on extra authority. Maybe this would allow the government to shut down the Jacobins and the people who want a republic and more radical ideas, to shut it all down. So for Lafayette, he thinks the war might be a way to put the brakes on everything and stop the revolution here. Right? But then, there's a faction within the Legislative Assembly, and they're sort of associated with the Jacobins. They're not a clear group, but they'll emerge as more clear later. They're called the Girondins, and they're called that because they come from the leaders of the Girondins come from a region of France called the Gironde, and so they're called the Girondins. And they're led by a guy named Brissot. They're sometimes called the Brissotins also. And Brissot, I want to point out, he was in the Grub Street Enlightenment. He was actually a police informer before the revolution. But now he's emerged as a revolutionary, and he's pretty much aligned with the Jacobins. Brissot is very much in favor of war also. But his reasons are very different, because Brissot thinks that the French Revolution, in order to really be safe, has to spread. He thinks a war is a great way to bring the French Revolution to Belgium and Germany and Italy and Spain. And so he welcomes the war as a way of spreading the French Revolution. And he thinks it'll make the war, it'll help solidify the position of the revolution and safeguard the revolution and maybe allow them to go a bit farther. The only people who really oppose the war are, ironically, some of the Jacobins. In particular, we're going to see a new guy show up who we're going to hear a whole lot about more later. But Maximilien Robespierre, he was in the National Assembly from 1789 onwards, but then he, of course, had to leave office when they elected the Legislative Assembly under the Constitution of 1791. So Robespierre is actually out of power, but Robespierre thinks the revolution or the war is a bad idea. He's afraid that starting a war would actually allow the Austrians and Prussians to come in and crush the revolution and destroy the revolution. So Robespierre wants to avoid the war, but everybody else, most of the Feuillants, the Girondins, the Royalists, everybody's pushing for war, and the Austrians are pushing for war. And so it's not surprising that it comes. And so in April 20th of 1792, France declares war on Austria, and then Prussia gets involved, and so the two kingdoms of Prussia and Austria basically invade France in April of 1792. All right. Well, the war does not go well at first. The French are not prepared for war. This new government does not have a good bureaucracy in place, and there's been so much damage done to the king's government before that. I mean, the Ministry of War is in total disarray. They don't have, a lot of plans in place. A lot of the people who had been part of the old war ministry had left. Lots of aristocrats had emigrated. They were really short on army officers. The French military had always been based on conscripting peasants, etc. They hadn't been doing much of that lately, so they were short on manpower. They were not ready. And as a result, the Austrians and Prussians start to push right into France, and they invade France. Now, they're actually not in a big hurry. They could have probably made a dash for Paris and maybe taken Paris right away. But they don't. What happens is they invade France, the French try to stop them, the Austrians and Prussians defeat the French military and move a little more on, the French try to stop them again, the Austrians and Prussians win again, they move a little farther, but they're not really pushing it very fast here. They're not really going as fast as they can. And at this point, I want to point out that the government, within the Legislative Assembly, the Girondins, led by Brissot, are really taking over everything. They've become the sort of dominant faction in the Legislative Assembly. They get themselves named to all the sorts of committees to run the war. And so the Brissotins, or the Girondins, led by Brissot, also called the Brissotins, are really running the government at this point. Okay. At this point, we know Lafayette is actually a general. And so he's out there fighting for the French army against the Austrians and Prussians. But we also know that Lafayette at this point, he's a feuillant, and he's really trying to sort of stop the revolution where it is. So he actually starts to negotiate with the Austrians and Prussians. This is treason. He starts to negotiate with the Austrians and Prussians and say, hey, if I surrender to you guys and you win the war, will you keep the Constitution of 1791 and keep the reforms the revolution has done? That'll allow you to keep Louis in power, that'll, et cetera. And the Austrians and Prussians are listening to him, but they're like, nah, we really don't like the whole idea of a constitution, we don't like the revolutionaries, etc. And the whole time this is happening, the Prussians and the Austrians keep pushing towards Paris. They're coming closer and closer to Paris. And people are starting to get a little terrified because, here the Austrians and Prussians just nobody seems to be able to stop them. Every time there's a battle, the Austrians and Prussians win, and they just keep coming and coming. And it gets even worse because on July 25th, the Duke of Brunswick, who was a Prussian general, issues a proclamation where he basically says, when we get to Paris, we're going to totally undo the revolution and we're stringing up the revolutionaries. Right? So he basically declares war on the revolution and says, we're coming for you revolutionaries. Well, this terrifies the people of Paris, right? They're like, well, what does that mean? Are they just going to be, killing everybody in Paris? Are they going to be carrying out mass executions? Who do they think belongs to the revolution? And so, as they get closer to Paris, the government of Paris and the population of Paris start to organize themselves. And there's multiple levels of the things going on because nobody agrees on anything. Right? There's the national government, the legislative assembly, which is led by Brissot, etc. They have one agenda, and then there's the army led by Lafayette. They have another agenda. But there's also the city government of Paris, right? And remember that on Bastille Day, they had lynched the previous governor mayor of Paris and killed him, Flesselles, and they had put in a new government in Paris, and it was led by a guy named Bailly, who was a sort of a moderate. And so Bailly is sort of preparing to defend Paris. But even below, and he's got a different agenda than the national government, etc. But even below that, there's also the people of Paris sort of want to do things to organize Paris. And in particular, I talked at the end of last lecture about sections. And the sections are basically these voting precincts for the Estates General elections back in 1788 and 89. And they had remained sort of neighborhood political centers for each neighborhood in Paris. There are 48 sections in Paris. And each section office was sort of a place that people went to talk about politics and went to organize and things like that. And so actually at this time in the summer of 1792, the Paris sections start to organize themselves and they start talking about putting together a militia to defend Paris, and they start recruiting working class people to defend the revolution and to fight against the Austrians and Prussians. And then you have the Jacobins, who are saying, well, we want a republic, etc. And so there's all sorts of agitation, and the closer the Austrians and Prussians get, the more everybody starts to panic, and the more everyone starts to feel the pressure, and the more all these conflicts start to come out into the open, and because people disagree on what their response should be. Well, at one point the government sends out a call for volunteers to the whole country. They say to the whole country, anybody who wants to volunteer to save the country from the Austrians and Prussians, come volunteer. And so all across the country, every city in France began to organize their own militia and send that militia to Paris to help stop the Austrians and Prussians. And just as a side note, the city of Marseille, France, which is way in the south on the Mediterranean, they organized a group of soldiers, militiamen, and they marched all the way from Marseille up to Paris. And on the way, they invented a marching song called the Marseillaise, named after the Marseille soldiers. And the Marseillaise is currently the national anthem of France. Da 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 da. And incidentally, if you read the lyrics to the song, this is the national anthem of France. It talks about watering the fields of France with the blood of our enemies, and it's a pretty gory song. It was certainly written by soldiers marching off to war. Well, the tension is growing throughout the summer. Every day there's a new report that the Austrians are closer, the Austrians are closer. On June 20th, 1792, which is say 1 year at the 1 year anniversary of Louis's flight to Varennes, a mob of Parisians breaks into the Tuileries And for 2 hours, they hold Louis hostage in a room, and they insult him, and they spit on him, and they make him drink toast to the revolution, and they make him wear a cockade hat, which is a revolutionary hat, and they basically just generally abuse him. And he didn't know if he was going to get killed any minute. So it was kind of a terrifying 2 hours before the National Guard finally came up and sort of dispersed things. Because of this break-in, Lafayette comes back from the front, and he tries to convince the National Assembly, or the Legislative Assembly, to shut down all the clubs, the Cordelier Club, the Jacobin Club, etc. And they don't do it because obviously there's a lot of members of the Jacobin Club, there are even some members of the Cordelier Club in the Legislative Assembly, and they don't want it shut down. So it stays there. But Lafayette consistently at this point is just trying to shut down the revolution. He is totally worried about it. Finally, on July 28th, the National Assembly authorizes the issuance of guns to everybody in Paris. Anybody who wants guns can have guns. Right? What could go wrong? Finally, in late July, the sections of Paris start to really get agitated, and the Jacobins are sort of organizing this, but the 48 sections of Paris decide to hold a vote on whether they think they should keep the king or get rid of the king and do a republic. And the vote comes back, the majority of people who voted in the sections want a republic. And so the 48 sections send a letter to the Legislative Assembly, and it's an ultimatum. It says, either you get rid of the king and create a republic, or we're going to do it for you on August 10th. Well, the Legislative Assembly is not ready to get rid of the king. The Feuillants do not want to get rid of the king. And for a Marxist, this is a real moment of class conflict, because the Marxists say, well, the Legislative Assembly was all rich people, it's the middle class, and the sections are mostly poor people, so this is the working class of Paris. So they're disagreeing on the government. The working class of Paris is saying, here, we want you to overthrow the government, and if you don't, we will. Right? Well, on August 8th, the news comes that Lafayette has deserted and crossed over to the Austrians. Right? So this is a real blow to the Feuillants, because Lafayette was the most famous of the Feuillants, and this really makes him look kind of suspicious. And then the August 10th deadline shows up. And so at midnight on August 9th, all the church bells start ringing in all the sections all across Paris, calling people to come and muster up at their section offices to march on the king's palace and overthrow the king. And for hours this goes on. There are people moving all the way across Paris through the middle of the night to organize themselves with their sections. And in particular, Danton at the Cordelier Club organizes a group of sans-culottes, the people of Paris, and they march on City Hall. And they overthrow the City Hall government, and they install a new government that they call the Commune. So Paris has a new city government. They've overthrown the city government. And then finally, in the early morning hours, between 6 and... actually, Danton takes City Hall between 6 and 7 a.m. And then the sections start marching towards the Tuileries Palace. Tuileries is over on this sort of western edge of Paris, right near the Seine. And so they start marching from all over Paris. They're converging on the Tuileries. And the king knows that they're coming. I mean, the ultimatum's been out there for weeks. And so the king is protected by 600 Swiss guardsmen. These are mercenaries from Switzerland who have been hired to defend the king. And so the king organizes the Swiss mercenaries to defend the palace of the Tuileries, and they're waiting for the crowds to come. Well, Louis apparently gets cold feet because at the last minute, he and his family duck out of the Tuileries, the palace, and they walk across this massive open space to the Manège, which is where the Legislative Assembly meets, and they basically throw themselves on the feet of the Legislative Assembly and say, save us. And so the members of the Legislative Assembly actually they're afraid of the crowds too. They don't know what's going to happen here. They don't know if the crowds are going to go after them also, but they decide to hide Louis and Marie Antoinette and their kids in a broom closet, right? And they say, you stay there, and we'll hope they don't find you. Well, the crowds get to the Tuileries, and the Swiss guards have not been given the order by Louis to surrender, and so they fight. They open fire on the crowds and they kill hundreds of people. And then the crowds charge the Tuileries, and the Swiss do another volley and kill more people. And finally, the crowds break into the Tuileries, and then it becomes hand-to-hand combat as the crowds are taking on the Swiss guards. And of course, the crowds, there's tens of thousands of people, and there's 600 Swiss guards, so it's not really a question of how this is going to end. But some of the Swiss guards get ripped to pieces right on the spot, murdered on the spot. Others try to break out of the crowd. They break out of the Tuileries and they actually start running through the streets of Paris. And the crowds chase them down and they're hacking people, Swiss guards, to death anywhere they find them, anywhere in the streets of Paris. And the king is hiding in the broom closet. Well, on August 17th, a week later, the Legislative Assembly decides to put people on trial for crimes against the state, and in particular, they put on any Swiss guards who managed to survive all that, they put them on trial, which is nice. On August 26th, the Prussians win a big battle at Longwy, and it looks like this was a spot the French army had hoped to stop them from getting to Paris. They lose at Longwy, and it looks like the Prussians are coming. And so the tension in Paris ratchets up again. Finally, on August 30th and 31st, Danton, who's a member of the Cordelier Club, persuades the Paris government. Remember, Danton had overthrown the Parisian government and put his own government in place. He persuades them to start carrying out searches for weapons, just go into people's houses in Paris. If somebody's suspicious, they can go into their houses and search for weapons. And the argument is that there's probably, this rumor began to really circulate, that there's got to be people who are in favor of the Prussians and Austrians winning. The people in Paris who hate the revolution. And the assumption is as soon as the Prussians and Austrians arrive, these counter-revolutionaries in Paris are going to rise up and maybe overthrow the government and attack the revolutionaries. So you've got to stop that. So Danton convinces the city commune to start searching houses of people who are suspicious, and if they find any guns, they arrest the people, and they take them off to prison. And about 3,000 people are arrested. And so, at this point, the city government set up by Danton and the Cordelier Club is now coming into open conflict with the Legislative Assembly, because the Legislative Assembly does not want these searches, and the Legislative Assembly has a lot of, like the Feuillants and a lot of moderates who really might be a little more favorable to the Austrians and Prussians than the Cordelier Club, and so you start to see a conflict between the city government controlled by the Cordelier Club and the radicals, and the Legislative Assembly, which is controlled by the Feuillants. On August 30th, the Girondins in the Legislative Assembly tried to call for new elections in this Paris city government. They want to hold new elections to get rid of this commune that Danton controls. In response, Robespierre, who is in the Legislative Assembly, or Robespierre at the Jacobin Club, calls for the arrest of several members of the Legislative Assembly. Right? Danton does not stops the city government from arresting them, but it's a close thing. That would have really set up a showdown, because if Robespierre had gotten his way, the city government would have arrested members of the Legislative Assembly, the national government, for treason, and that would have set up a real showdown. But the city commune does set up a committee to search out traitors, right? And in particular, they put a guy named Jean-Paul Marat in charge of this committee. And Marat was an interesting character. He had been a member he published a newspaper called L'Ami du Peuple, and he basically had been sort of a total radical, calling for a republic, he had actually predicted in the L'Ami du Peuple, he had predicted that the king was going to try to run for it because he'd heard rumors that turned out to be correct. And Marat was really hated the aristocracy and hated the monarchy, etc. Well, they put him in charge of searching out suspicious characters. On September 2nd, the Prussians take Verdun. And Verdun is this fortress that stands across a river. I mean, it doesn't. The fortress doesn't stand across a river. Verdun, the town, sprawls across this river, and it feeds right into the Seine, which leads to Paris. There's really no geographical boundaries between Verdun and Paris. Once you've taken Verdun, you have a straight shot at Paris. So the Prussians take Verdun, and it really looks like the Prussians are going to get to Paris soon. And people start to panic. They start to lose their heads. Danton issues a call calling for 30,000 people to volunteer to go fight at the front. He gives a famous speech where he says, if we are bold and bolder still and forever bold, we will win. And France is saved. And so he calls on the sans-culottes, the working classes of Paris, who are his constituency, to volunteer to go fight against the Prussians. But lots of people, especially in the sections, the sans-culottes in the sections, are really worried about counter-revolutionaries. They're really worried about those 3,000 people who got arrested by the city commune for having weapons, and they're in prison now. They're really worried about some of the people in the Legislative Assembly who don't seem to be totally on board with the republic, with the idea of a republic. And so a lot of people began to say, we can't volunteer to go fight at the front if Paris isn't secure, if there are counter-revolutionaries in Paris. And this sets in motion what would come to be called the September Massacres. On September 2nd, there's a group of prisoners in a wagon being taken from a prison at l'Abbaye Saint-Germain-des-Prés, which is sort of in the southwestern portion of Paris. It's on the left bank. They stop, and they're being taken to the Palais de Justice, which is where the trials are. And the crowd stops this wagon, and it grabs all the people in the wagon, all the suspects who are going to be put on trial, and it puts them on trial in the street, and it kills them all, 17 of them. And then crowds of people start to say, well, we should do that with all the prisons. And so over the next week, from September 2nd until roughly the 9th, it actually is sort of just peters out, so it's not a really good end date. But over the next several days, from September 2nd onward, crowds of people broke into each of Paris's prisons, and they would break into the prisons, and they would take control of the prison, and then they would grab 3 people from the crowd off the street, just 3 ordinary guys, and they would say, you're the judges. And then they would bring out each prisoner from the prison one by one in front of the judges, and they would read out what they supposedly did, what they were charged with, and the judges had to give a verdict right there. And they had 2 verdicts: let them go free or execute them. And then what would happen is the judges would give their verdict, and then the person would be shoved out of the prison into the street where all the crowds are, and they would announce this person's guilty or this person's innocent. And if they were innocent, the crowd would give them wine and cheer them and put them on their shoulders and march them around a little bit and let them go. But if they were pronounced guilty, the crowd would jump on them with knives and sticks and whatever, and they would beat them and they would hack them to death, they would cut them to pieces, and they would murder them. Overall, if you look at all the prisons in Paris, roughly, what's interesting is there were usually a significant number of people who were let go, right? These were not just death squads. At l'Abbaye prison, there were 450 prisoners, and 250 were released. And 200 were killed. So 56 were released, and 44% were killed. At La Salpêtrière, there were 270 prisoners, and 235 were let go. So 87% were freed. At Le Châtelet, 20% were freed, 80% were killed. At La Conciergerie, we have different numbers, but somewhere between 1/3 and 2/3 were let go, and 1/3 and 2/3 were killed. At Bicêtre, 50% were freed, 50% were killed. At Carmes, 25% were freed, 75% were killed. At La Force, 2/3 were freed, and 1/3 were killed. And at Saint-Firmin, 1/4 were freed and 3/4 were killed. And so overall, between 1,000 and 1,400 people were killed. They were just massacred in the streets. And one of the most famous cases was the Princesse de Lamballe. She had been a personal friend of Marie Antoinette. She was a really high-ranking aristocrat. She was a princess, and which means she was married to one of the king's cousins, basically. And she was sort of a symbol of court society, and she was pronounced guilty and sent out to the crowds, and they ripped her clothes off, and they beat her, and they hacked her to pieces, and left her body displayed naked on the street for hours and maybe days, to show everybody what happened to aristocrats. Right. Once this problem had been taken care of, the prison problem had been taken care of, the sections, everybody in the section, not everybody, but lots of people in sections, about 30,000 people, volunteered to go fight the Prussians. And so they put together this enormous force of just anybody off the street, gave him a gun, and marched him out to stop the Prussians. And much to everybody's surprise, on September 20th, at Valmy, outside of Paris, the French army stopped the Prussians cold. And they had a huge victory at Valmy. And this basically stopped the Prussians and saved Paris. And at this point, the Prussians were willing to negotiate at this point. They were like, okay, maybe this is a bad idea. Maybe we can negotiate to save Louis and save some sort of, they were thinking about, Lafayette had been willing to negotiate an end to this. The Prussians like, maybe. But that was September 20th. On September 21st, the Legislative Assembly announced that they had abolished the monarchy and had declared a republic. When the Prussians heard that, they're like, nope, no negotiations, we do not want a republic, and so the war was on again. But in the process, then the Legislative Assembly had decided that they really had to go with a republic. Enough people in the Legislative Assembly had been won over by the Jacobins that they were willing to go with it. And so they held elections for the Republic, and they were electing basically what they called a constitutional convention, because this convention was going to write a new constitution for a Republic of France. So, this is 1792, so the Constitution of 1791 had basically lasted for a year, and they're getting rid of it. And so they have a new set of elections for a constitutional convention in early September, and it's an interesting group. Looking at them, there were 749 deputies in the Legislative Assembly that was elected under the Constitution of 1791. 200 of them come back, and they're in the Constitutional Convention. Right? There was no rule that they couldn't run again. So 200 of the people who had been in the Legislative Assembly come back for the Constitutional Convention. And those people were all they were mostly lawyers, they were wealthy, bourgeois people, usually not aristocrats. There were 83 people who had been in the original National Assembly who had stepped down when the Legislative Assembly had been elected in 1791. They're now eligible to be in the legislature again, so they come back. So there's 83 people from the original National Assembly who get elected again. But what's kind of interesting is that the Brissot and the Girondins largely got reelected, so that faction was still in place. Lots of Jacobins got elected. Robespierre is back in the National Assembly, right? Or the Constitutional Assembly. Marat and Danton are both elected to the Constitutional Convention. So you've got a lot more radicals there than used to. And you also have some interesting ones. 2 Englishmen, well, 1 Englishman, 1 American get elected. Joseph Priestley, who was the guy who discovered oxygen. He's one of the founders of the Unitarian Church. He invented soda water, so he invented soda pop. He was actually in England, but they elected him on his name alone because he had been known to be a supporter of the French Revolution and a supporter of Republican principles. Tom Paine, the guy who wrote Common Sense in the American Revolution, gets elected to the National Assembly. He doesn't speak any French, but he's there, so they elect him because he's famous as a revolutionary. But what's my favorite one here is the cousin of the King of France, the Duc d'Orléans, who is one of the wealthiest, most important aristocrats in the entirety of France. The Duc d'Orléans gets elected, but at this point he had embraced revolutionary ideology. He had rejected the name, his original name, and he is taking the name Philippe Égalité. Philip Equality was the name he went by now. He gets elected to the Constitutional Convention, right? And he actually sits with the most radical Jacobins, and they like him. They think he's a great radical, right? So this Constitutional Convention now has to write a constitution for a Republic of France, but they also are the legislature that have to run the war against the Austrians and Prussians. That's still going on. And they're going to face a whole lot of other difficulties because the revolution, all those tensions I mentioned between Catholics and nationalists, between the bourgeoisie and the working class, the different ideas about liberty and etc., all those things are going to come bursting out into the open in 1793. So we'll find out what happens next time.